stage is yours, Jim.
Well, thank you. Appreciate you guys taking time out of your Friday evening. I know it's beer time, but here we are talking about space. So you must really like this this topic. So thank you for listening. So what I'm going to talk about tonight is pretty much the theme that I've been talking about for 20 years, and it's finally becoming a reality. So 20 years ago, people thought, I was somewhat of a lunatic, along with this guy, Elon Musk, that we were going to do all these things ourselves instead of letting the government do it. But now, as we know, sometimes crazy people actually get stuff done. So I'll give you a little bit of where I think it's going and some insight into how it got there along the way. There's a lot of different paths, but I've been fortunate in my lifetime to have been along the path that I've seen a lot of the new space develop on its own. I call this the new space race. So to me, it's bigger and better than what happened between the Soviets and the Americans back 50 years ago. So I'll start with this business of the New York skyline, and this is what you would see in the late 1800s if you were alive. It was a little bit different than today. There was a lack of tall buildings, and that was in main part due to the fact there were no elevators, and getting things above, say, 3 or 4 floors was a lot of work and near impossible for very large things, unless you were, for the average person, really an unworkable situation. So when you go forward, I'm trying to get it, there you go, to today, you see that the skyline's totally different. And, there are buildings hundreds of floors tall, and it's enabled by elevator technology. And this elevator technology is what I kind of think of as the equivalent of today's rockets, and space transportation. So it took not only the real estate of New York City and expanded it vertically, but along with it expanded the economy that could happen there. So I think that analogy applies very well to what's going on in space today. And the launch systems are really our future elevators for getting our ideas and our assets in space to create value from that vantage point. And there's a lot of things you can do there, some of which we know today, much of which we don't know today. So we can only guess at what the future might hold. I'm 57 years old, and I remember when cell phones first came out, and that was magical enough that you could drive around in your car and talk to somebody on the phone. But now to have GPS embedded in each cell phone and all the applications that come from that simple addition to the phone are pretty amazing. So we see the same kind of future for space. And today, the main application of putting satellites up is to move bits back and forth between various places on Earth in a more efficient manner. Number one. Number two, to take photons that are measured, the images, which are really just photons, and turning those into a decision quality data that people can make decisions with. So in the future, who knows what else is going to go on? People talk about space mining. They talk about, Jeff Bezos talks about growing, plants and manufacturing in space. Elon talks about going to Mars. All these are probably all true, and even more that we don't even know about today. So the problem is really, in my mind, that today's space commerce is very hardware centric. It takes a lot of capital. If you're going to start a space business, $10 million is kind of a low amount of money. And you're going to measure new capabilities in terms of years. But if you look at, tech, and if you're familiar with, that industry, people can come up with software programs in months and do it for hundreds of thousands of dollars and create millions of dollars worth of value. So tomorrow, for space to become a more robust economy, it has to become software centric. This will drive capex requirements down, as well as new capabilities. So I see it going that direction, but there's still a lot of capex that has to be spent on infrastructure, mainly in just getting to space. And once you solve that problem, it's kind of like the internet, which was the basic transportation for information. Once you've got that handled, then it's easy to.
Es lo que decíamos. Okay.
It's like somebody's talking there. Can everybody
muted him? Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So at any rate, we've got a long ways to go in space. We're still in the laying out the infrastructure, but the promise of a software-centric space industry, I think, is there, and probably in your lifetimes you'll see it really blossom. Maybe in my lifetime, I hope so. All right, where are we? There we go. So the technology is also getting very disruptive. What we're seeing today is a microsatellite that is much smaller in scale, physical scale, compared to what the past has been. This was a typical geostationary satellite from, say, even 10 years ago, which weighed as much as a bus that's pulling people around the streets of whatever city you live in, and is costing hundreds of millions of dollars. But they're also, making fairly large amounts of money by pushing bits back and forth from the space, and have large power systems that are hundreds of kilowatts and so forth. So, it wouldn't be hundreds of kilowatts; it'd be tens of kilowatts. There, I'm thinking of homes. So at any rate, where we're going with is a much smaller satellite that is less costly, and this has some important implications because just like your phones, the performance capability of this technology is far outstripping anything we had in the past, and it's in fact far outstripping our ability to launch the assets. So this gives you a little bit of data of the size disruption and trace it back to the early 90s. And I haven't updated the data, but it's continued to proliferate even stronger up until today. And you can see there's sort of a top line that about 30 years ago was about 5,000 kilos, 2,000 to 5,000, somewhere in there. And now it's up to, about 8. And that reflects the size of large launch vehicles growing. So that's a trend that you actually see, as these very large vehicles actually get a little bit bigger, because the satellites that go to geostationary orbit that you were just talking about, really they're taking a physical place in orbit that's like a beachfront property. And so that very valuable asset, which is limited, is something that you want to put more expensive assets into. And so they end up getting bigger and bigger because the return on investment gets higher for this very valuable piece of real estate up there. And sort of on the opposite end, you see, the satellite mass is dropping as time goes on. And that's really driven by the technology and sort of the minimum amount of mass that you need to do a certain amount of things in space. And so while the satellites on the lower end are less capable, obviously, than the top ones, that capability starts to blur, particularly when you get in the recent 10 years and the recent last 5 years. The growth in capability on these very small satellites has been explosive. So here's an example of Planet satellites, their first generation of CubeSats that they're making by the hundreds, literally. And these are imaging satellites that are creating a living, breathing image cloud of planet Earth. And while the images are very low resolution and the tracks of these satellites are not controlled, the power of having hundreds of these in orbit has been really interesting to see. And for me, I've got a little bit of a background in automotive as well as space, to see sort of the what automotive would call low production rate, in space we call high production rate in the hundreds. See how the reliability plays out has been very interesting indeed. So it mimics a lot of what we see in the automotive world, which makes me believe that that's also a very good analogy as well. So Planet is now employing a mixture of larger satellites, which they acquired ultimately from Skybox Imaging, which I helped start and helped design that satellite years ago, and these smaller ones. So it's a nice mixture of these two things, and they're actually doing fairly well. They went public during the SPAC craziness of last year, and they're one of the few of the companies that are actually keeping their head above water in this insane market that we're in right now. So this is an example of the kind of imagery that Planet's returning. And what's interesting about it is, classically in the past, we've only been able to get image returns at certain times of the day. So we would put satellites in orbits where they would cross over at 10:30 a.m. local time and 10:30 p.m. local time, so that we got consistent sun angles. So really, if you're a bad guy and you want to hide something, you just watch your watch and like, hey, the Americans are coming over at 10:30. We're gonna hide our stuff, and 11 o'clock you go back out. So with not that there's nefarious things as the only thing we watch, even just economic activity. There's an amazing amount of things you can see by watching a city, sort of like a neighborhood watch program, and you can see stuff going on that you can deduce value-added data from. And I know one company uses these data to evaluate how much oil is out there in the inventory in a true sense. If you look at the reports you get from various countries, you can't trust them to be correct, and stuff gets missed. But if you look at it from orbit, you can see the tops on the oil storage containers fall with depletion of the oil in the container. You can actually measure that from orbit by looking at the shadows. So that's just one small example of the kind of economic benefit and value that's created from this. And so what I'm really trying to point out to you guys is that once you have these data, once you have this infrastructure, you get other smart people to come in and start thinking of other things. Not all of us think alike, thankfully. And there's a lot of smart people out there that aren't space people that can come in, that aren't engineers, right? I know we're all engineers. We think we're the smartest. I would argue with you, but at any rate, that's probably futile. Any rate, so there's a lot of smart people out there that can take these data and create more value out of it. So that's the tipping point that happens when we get enough of this stuff into space, and we're just about there, I think. I was involved on a military aspect of this, where somebody from the Pentagon called me, gosh, it's been almost 10 years ago, and they were having trouble knowing when North Korea was going to set off a nuclear weapon or launch a missile. And they were simply hiding from our imaging satellites of the Defense Department, knowing that they're coming over at a certain time of day. So what their idea was to somehow get a hold of Planet imagery of North Korea and set up a neighborhood watch program. We did that. We did it for about $10 million, which was a bargain as far as the Defense Department sees it. And we had them take imagery of North Korea, and we correlated certain activities that you wouldn't see if you looked just one time a day. Even if they weren't hiding, you just wouldn't see it. And so we saw certain things that happened that correlated with a nuclear test. So we had a heads up on these things. Same with the missile tests. So that was a very successful program, and now it's a program of record, which means it's an ongoing thing. at the Pentagon. So they're starting, even the militaries are starting to see the value of these private developed satellite constellations, and no need to spend public funds to do what the commercial industry can. I was also involved in a solar sail called Light Sail. If some of you are aware of this, you're probably aware that Bill Nye makes the claim to it. Bill Nye came along after it was designed and built, but it was kind of my brainchild along with Lou Friedman, and we built it with Tom Svitek up in San Luis Obispo, California. And you can see a picture of it there before it flew. It's still up there flying successfully, but this is so far the only human object capable of interstellar voyage. If we pointed lasers at it, and continued to be able to point them at it, we could actually reach speeds such that interstellar flight would happen in our lifetime. So, this was not done with a penny of government money, and it just shows you that the commercial side of things can do a lot of various things other than make money as well. So, when you start talking about humans in space, then you really have only nation states have done this in the past. We're starting to see that change, and that's a big deal. The reason nation states did it was because not only were they big and complex, but they were very expensive. And today we see private companies doing this and more. And this is the famous first flight of Falcon Heavy, which, by the way, Light Sail was on, that one I just showed you. And they landed their 2 boosters. I mean, it was spectacular what these guys did. And I can tell you, when I was there at the beginning in SpaceX the first year, I had no idea we'd ever get to this point, and if Elon did, he never told any of us. So, we just wanted to build a small little Falcon 1 in the early days. But, as time went on, more resources became available. These guys were able to use those resources very efficiently and do some incredible things. So we're starting to see this blending of what private companies can do that only nation states could do before, because they can do it so much more efficiently and they don't need nation state level capital. So this is also the private launching of what's now U.S. astronauts to the space station. The U.S. does not currently have a way to send astronauts into space based on a government-built rocket. The SLS is going to supposedly launch Sunday, but that's mainly a moon lander, and it's a very big rocket that they spent some $50 billion on to get to this point. And SpaceX spent a little under $1 billion to get the basic capsule and the Falcon 9 flying. So you're looking at a 50-to-1 ratio of capital efficiency, and that's why the future belongs to commercial rather than government space, I believe. So tomorrow, I think we're going to see private citizens going back to the moon, going into space. Maybe if Bezos is successful in what he wants to do, actually living and working in space, and that would be quite something to see. If you look at the Starship that SpaceX is working on, that's an interesting thing, because last year there were 700 metric tons of satellites flown into space, and the Starship flies 100 metric tons per launch. So if you think that Starship is aimed at just launching satellites, that doesn't pan out at the 7 launches per year. Even if they charged $100 million per launch, that's still under $1 billion a year of revenue, which is doesn't justify having spent $4 or $5 billion on developing the vehicle. So the only thing that really makes any sense, because satellites aren't growing that rapidly in mass or number to justify the Starship, it has to be taking people and all the stuff that goes behind them, like water and support systems, and going to Mars what are you going to take to Mars? You're going to take people, you're going to take food, you're going to take water, you're going to take supplies to live off the land, you're going to take boring machines to go underground, and you're going to take Teslas to drive around on. So that you start to see this madness of Elon. The only thing that doesn't seem to fit in is Twitter. But this other madness is really kind of looking at one thing, which is settling Mars, which is actually what I think the only real reason for having Starship is. So this is what I imagine the future to be. I was growing up in the 60s and 70s and watched Star Trek. People ask me, do you prefer Star Trek or Star Wars? And for me, it was only Star Trek, right? So I can't, Star Wars came along when I was much older and I was an adult. So it's, for me, not a competition. But, this kind of future is somewhere out there, I still believe. And we don't know enough about the physics to be able to travel like we did in Star Trek in our minds. But I'm confident someday we'll understand some of these mysteries of physics in such a way that we can harness this time travel, which is really what it amounts to. The distance is just so large, you have to resort to some form of time travel to be able to make it in a finite lifetime. Either that, or we learn how to live infinitely long, which would bore the hell out of me, I have to tell you. I don't know about you guys, but I'm old enough to realize that we humans get old and die off because we have young people like you that come along with fresh new ideas and don't believe we can't do something. So having been through that myself, I see the value of people dying off and being replaced, and that's not a bad thing. So here's the reality, though. We talk about Starship Enterprise, but launch is very, very hard. It's not so hard technically, it's just unforgiving. And it is so energetically intense and such high speed, which is another way to say energetically intense, that anything that goes wrong is going to result in some major failures, and sometimes catastrophic. So it's very fault intolerant. It's much like very high speed race cars. They're also a bit fault intolerant because of their their risk to life. And so in much the same way, launch is a simple device, but it's just very, very hard to do, mainly because of the experience. So in reality, when you get down to it, launch becomes a question of financial capital and human capital. And I think the human capital is becoming the harder part of it. Those that have enough experience to know what to do and what not to do. And that becomes the big dividing line for groups that are developing future space transportation. So the other part of it is just as plain capital intensive. So, the smaller you make it, the less money it costs, as it turns out, to develop. And that's been a well-known factor. This is a space shuttle engine. You wouldn't think it was that big, but look how big it is. And you can bet that's a very expensive engine. So, we've somehow got to figure out how to do this in a way that it doesn't require billion-dollar level investments. So, in a lot of ways, one of the places to look is to public transportation systems. And, this is a train system. I don't know where it is, probably Europe somewhere. And I suppose I could look at the sign here, but it's probably billions of dollars to build these systems. So much like, some of the big rockets, they're also examples of very, very expensive implementations there as well. But, when we start to think about the transportation system, we have to think about space transportation as being part of it. And it's also something, and this is another thing that some people think the Starship will be as a point-to-point transport on Earth through space, right? Rather than to space, through space. And that may very well be, taking off from the harbor in New York and landing in Japan an hour later is kind of an interesting idea, having spent enough time on jets going and doing that. would certainly be convenient to not have to spend that much time in transit, but that's probably a few years away. The automobile then becomes an interesting example as it relates to space transportation. It's what we would call bespoke, which means really very tailored. So in the case of the automobile, it's tailored to you being able to choose as the operator of the automobile where you go, how fast you go, and it's tailored to meet your particular needs, regardless of the mass of other people that are out there. Now, you can't just drive it anywhere. You can't drive it through somebody's backyard or through the stores. It would be nice to maybe drive it through some of the larger stores, but I don't think the reception would be very good there. So you do have, some avenues you have to stay on, but largely it's a lot more flexible than, say, taking a plane where you're in a public transportation going to the same place with everybody else. And so for that, then, we always look back to Henry Ford as being the guy who changed everything, and Ford Motor Company who changed terrestrial transportation. It's important to recognize, if you don't already know, that back in the early 1900s, a typical automobile was a mere toy of the very wealthy. And then your dollars, you could buy a Benz or something like that for about $8,000. And, the average person would make hundreds of dollars a year. And so it was completely out of reach for most people. And Henry Ford came along and said, look, we're going to build the Model T. We're going to build it using mass production and bring the price down to $400 and $500 per unit so that the average family could afford it. So Henry Ford's a bit of a paradox, incidentally, in a historic sense. He was an isolationist. He did not want to see the United States get involved in World War II. He was considered very conservative, but in a way, he was a bit of a socialist by creating an artificially inflated wage for his workers, so that they could live a better life and afford these cars. You could call that self-serving, but in a sense, he actually had a sense of socialism with his workers, that he wanted them to make what he called a living wage. So that's just an interesting sort of observation on the guy. He's a bit of a mystery in the historical context to me, and don't really know what he was. You never know how history tends to change the reality of what was there. I've met his grandson, who's a very nice guy, but Henry, by all accounts, was a real son of a bitch. So, but nonetheless, he definitely contributed this change to the world, and it was a vision he couldn't get rid of that was plaguing him, I guess, that he made come true. So we all owe a debt of gratitude to Henry Ford for changing our lives and the way we get around the world today, even. And what he used was very simple mass production. The idea being that all the parts were made to the same specification and assembled in a line like this, where one station, one person did one function. Even today, some of the higher end, say, Italian cars are not made this way. They're made in one place. They don't move. The parts come to it with one or two people that assemble it. Ferrari is moving away from that. Maserati used to do it that way. They moved to a complete moving assembly line. But this was, back in 1917, they're doing these sort of things, and this was new. This was not the norm. Prior to that, things were all handmade, and really in the great tradition of coach builders. So this is what changed it. And Henry Ford's famous for saying you can have any color as long as it's black. So we have a next generation of micro launchers that I think will become the equivalent of the Model T, and I'm involved in this. This is why I think about this. Rocket Lab's the clear leader of this. We think that Rocket Lab's going to start to mimic SpaceX and go for the bigger vehicles, because their first rocket, like many first entrants to the market, is too complex and too expensive. They charge $7 million for this and kind of put about 150 kilos up. where our rocket, for example, is $4 million for 3 times that capacity. So their technology is more suitable for something that's maybe a little bit more expensive, that has to be larger. And but there will be a successful small launch company that builds these and flies these by the hundreds, I guarantee you. And that will fill the part of the market, much like the Model T did for terrestrial transportation. So it was really kind of interesting then to think about a number of quadrants of the launch transportation system. So you have, on one axis, a high cost per kilogram, and then a low cost on the other side. And then the other axis is responsiveness. In other words, how quickly can you launch and how often can you launch? And so what you really want is the lowest cost and the highest responsiveness for all of your satellites. But as it turns out, you can really only do this, at least with today's technology, with smaller vehicles. But I think it's more a artifact of the sheer size, sort of the physical practicality of the smaller vehicle that lends themselves to mass manufacturing, transport, and then operations, quick turn operations on the launch site. So you really are limited to more or less 500 kilograms or less in this class. But if you do enough of them, you can manufacture them and get the learning curve costs down and get very cost competitive, which is competitive with what today is the SpaceX model of reusable large launch. And they also get that cost down, but they're a lot lower responsiveness because they're launching 20 or 30 times a year. So these are going to become the two competing transportation economic systems in the future. Whereas reusable large launch is already established, it'll continue to grow and refine, and we're high rate small launches really in the nascent period. And our traditional legacy launch is going to gradually die in the moderate rate small launch, and then the low rate large launch, which is typical of the government systems. Those will become things of the past. So one of the things that drives this interest in small is just a recognition that a linear reduction scale results in an exponential reduction in costs. As much as I don't like the idea, but I know it to be true, is that the smaller something is, the less it weighs, and the less it weighs, the less it costs to build. And I used to, when I was younger, argue with this until I was blue in the face, but I know this to be true because of all the things I've done. Always ends up this way. It's not a perfectly linear relationship, but it's a pretty strong relationship. And so make something smaller, it's going to cost less. And so if you look at the other side of it, which is how many can you make, that's how you can get the cost down. So if you look at cost to orbit on a dollar per kilogram basis, which by the way, nobody buys truly that, that metric. When you go to buy a satellite, satellite launch, there's a lot of other factors. But if you look at the large reusable launch, they're generally in the $7,500 down to $2,500 per kilogram. Once you get a production rate up in the 50, 60, 100 a year, you definitely get in that range. And then you've got other factors like your ability to place things where they want to go, when they want to go. It becomes very attractive. So you can see why I argue that these are two economic systems that will compete in the future. So the manufacturing side of things, the approach is really not something that has to have new science invented. Really, we just mimic, go from what was done with the Maseratis, years ago, which is really what SpaceX does today, by the way. And because of the sheer size of their vehicles, they can't do much else, to the way Maserati does things today, and a moving assembly line and so forth. And, it's easy to manufacture those by hundreds a year. The bigger issue is launching them at those rates, because there are not many federal ranges in the US where you can launch. There's only 4. In the rest of the world, there's a very limited place there. So it's appropriate to think of launch sites as being something akin to the most valuable real estate in the world, and your rights to fly out of those is akin to airports having the rights for airlines to fly in and out of, and so that real estate is going to become very valuable as these economic systems develop. So what we're doing at Phantom is trying to address that problem by developing our Daytona vehicle to fly at hundreds a year. And one of the things we started with was a launch site that is compatible with that high rate of operation and a network of those sites around the world. So you have to start thinking operationally in the very beginning and how you design the vehicle for this kind of operations. And so that's a different kind of thinking that I hope to be successful with. So this infrastructure will really be what throttles the future space transportation. There's some schools of thought where people will say, well, it'll become so ubiquitous that the costs will come down and there'll be commoditized costs. The real restriction will be, the reason that won't happen is launch infrastructure will keep those rates down. So there will always be a bit of a competition for space transportation until we solve the larger launch infrastructure, which I don't think is going to happen in the next 10 or 20 years, because that involves environmental approvals and large capex and people, what we call here in the US NIMBY, not in my backyard. And nobody wants to have a launch site in their backyard. You'd be surprised how much opposition there is to it, even like in places like Florida, where they make a lot of money off of it. So, we're looking at this is our launch site out of Vandenberg on the left, at being able to use these fairly simple, low-cost modular pads at numerous sites so that we can be working on one vehicle while the other one's getting ready to launch, and do this in a very rapid cycle time. So we're launching 2 to 4 per week out of each site. And so you can start to see how those numbers work out pretty well. You can get to hundreds of years off of that. And then, SpaceX's model, the tens of flights per year, they're up to 40 or 50, something like that. They're doing really great. That'll be our competition out there. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit here and talk about where I think this all goes. And all this has been great, talking about unmanned satellites and how we create value. And that's going to be one of the biggest economies in our world in a very short period of time. It's already $500 billion a year. Morgan Stanley thinks it'll be $2 trillion by 2040. I don't doubt that. But then what's even more important is when we start to venture off this earth, this has the kind of importance you can't put a dollar figure on. And we are, as a species, a wandering species. We always are seeking bigger and better things. It's just in our DNA, and we can't get out of it. And that's not a bad thing. So we'll move into space based on this desire that we can't even really describe. I think Carl Sagan described it as a lost song from childhood that you can barely remember. And so private citizens will be the ones that settle space, and the new world was settled. Spain sent its armadas here 500 years ago, and there was some of the initial beachheads, if you will, into North America, but it was private citizens who flooded the shores that eventually settled North and South America. And so it won't be any different in space. And the government won't do it alone. If you're waiting around for the government to do it, you're going to be waiting a long, long time. So the other thing to think about is the coming battle in space. Because there's value being created in space, there's going to be economic contests in space. And whether we like it or not, and I don't like it, it's an inevitable reality. And so my thinking is the best way to think about this is how do we deter a war from ever happening in space? And if you are a cynic, you might say, and you might be very well justified, that when has deterring war ever worked? Generally, it hasn't, but except in one circumstance, I think it's very important, nuclear war. So, being older, I remember growing up and we had nuclear drills where we had a bombing raid and we had to get under our desks, and I called it the kiss your ass goodbye raid. And of course, I got in trouble for saying that once in class, but we get under the desks and hide as if that's going to shield us from a nuclear weapon going off. So I was always convinced that this was probably the way I was going to die. And it was a very real threat back then. It's hard for those that didn't live through it to realize, how existential a threat it really was seen as. It turns out it wasn't maybe as bad as we think it was, but what kept the peace was this deterrence of someone else having it. And as illogical as that seems, having a number of these balances of countries each having nuclear weapons, preventing the other from using them. The only time they were ever used on civilian populations was when only one country had them. So we have to think about the same thing in space. And, the best thing we can do is deter that. And in my mind, the best way to deter it is to zero the cost of replacement or minimize the cost of replacement, and thereby zero the benefit someone would have of attacking someone else's assets in space. Starlink is a great example of that. During this Ukrainian war that's going on, you probably all know that Ukrainian soldiers were using Starlink as their primary network of communications because the Russians had taken out all the ground communications. And the Russians were getting frustrated with this and threatened to destroy the satellites. And by the way, it wasn't just Starlink they were threatening to destroy. There's a company called ISI in Finland that I was involved in the early days. I was on the board for years. They were giving radar imagery to the Ukrainians. That was the other satellites they threatened to destroy. So, but the Russians, I think, did the calculus on Starlink. You could shoot down 2 or 3. Maybe you're really good and you shoot down 20. If you've got 1,500, it doesn't put a dent in the capability. So proliferating constellations is one way to deter it. The other is, if you've got sort of higher value satellites and fewer number of them, if somebody can shoot them down and you just got another one to replace it, there's little value in the aggressor taking down the satellites because, I can guarantee you there's going to be a high cost on Earth for countries that do that, at least until the whole barrier of war in space is broken down and we create a debris hell out there. So I hope that never happens because it'll make it damn near impossible to continue activities in space with something like that. So this is the dark cloud in the silver lining. So, it's tempting with all of this to just stick your head in the sand and say, I don't know how to fix any of this stuff. But, when you're in private enterprise, you just say, screw it, we're going to go do it. And, this might be the temptation to put your head in the sand, but the rest of us get busy and go out and do it. And those are the ones that move humanity forward. This is a picture I took back in 2002. This was SpaceX, our first headquarters. And we actually built later the Falcon 1s here. But I remember looking out from my office, and that's Elon's McLaren. And he was too cheap to paint the floors. I said, look, we got to epoxy the floors. And you see this insulation in the ceiling. It was falling down and providing contamination. We can never build rockets here. And I remember thinking, there's no way we'll ever build a single rocket here let alone do all those things you see, right? So just because things don't look today like what our imagination of the Starship Enterprise are, has nothing to do with reality, truly. So they do this now, and who would imagine, right? Looking at that, look back at this, and then you say this now. Okay, billions of dollars, but they did it, and they did it on private capital. So the first humans, I think, will come to Mars by private taxi, not by government buses. And in my lifetime, there's been lots and lots of discussion of government programs going to Mars and how expensive it will be and so on. Meanwhile, this is really the core focus of SpaceX. It was in the early days, and I know it is still today. You see all these other things going on, but these are all steps in a very large process to get to Mars. And I have no doubt it won't be probably in this capsule, but this was a nice drawing somebody put together that I absconded with that gives the point. But when they get there, they'll have to live off the land. We just can't afford to send so much supplies there. That's why this business of, is there ice underneath the surface is important. Water is one of the fundamental building blocks of life, as we all know. But water can also be recycled. I live here in Tucson, Arizona, and there's a biosphere that some good friends of mine actually built and were in there for 2 years that show that you can actually have a closed cycle environment like this on Mars and survive there. They had a lot of problems, but they weren't, fundamental problems couldn't be overcome. I would call them more engineering problems. They had a carbon sink in the concrete, for example. And so that amount of carbon was coming out of the ecosystem, and they were getting poor harvests and so forth. So anyhow, those sort of things can be fixed by the right choice of materials. And this is why I say this is probably what the Boring Company is really all about. It's not building tunnels underneath the cities. It's about building tunnels on the surface, under the surface of Mars, so you can go down there and live underneath. That's probably the best place for people to live, as well, underneath the surface. It's more temperate. It's can be pressurized without having heavy structures, so that people can be in shirt sleeves. And it certainly is radiation tolerant. The radiation's absorbed at the surface and so forth. So anyhow, this is one version of it, but it'll look something like this. I almost guarantee it. And we'll be terraforming Mars, but on the inside of our habitats. And I can also tell you that I know who the most famous human ever is. And this person's not born. Couldn't tell you if this person's male or female, what race, where they come from, what language they speak. I have no idea. But it'll be the first human that's born not on the Earth. And if you think of that in terms of our species evolution, that's an awe-inspiring thought. And it will be done by private citizens, I almost guarantee you, and not the government. So that is to say that our ultimate expression of human achievement and liberty won't be government program, and that ought to be a thought that puts a smile to your face, because you as engineers will want to do things and build things, and in order to do that, we have to rely on ourselves to get that done. And now in space, if you're interested in space, there's an avenue for you to go do it. So this is one of the most exciting things to come along in my lifetime, is to see this new space race evolve. And I walked away from the industry 15 years ago. I was sick of it. I was sick of the government programs not doing anything, wasting public dollars. And I got drawn back into it through Skybox. And wow, am I glad this happened. It's invigorated me again. So I'm grateful for it. So this is, leave you with this thought. And, this was, I think, one of the greatest stunts ever to be made. Elon launching his Tesla to space. I mean, I joked early on about launching my old Maseratis into space. I collect old Maseratis, and I had a burned one that I had in a trailer once when we were at a meeting in Colorado, and he looked in there. He says, "What the hell are you doing collecting stuff like this?" I said, "Well, we're gonna launch it on the first Falcon launch vehicle," and he thought that was funny. That's like Elon carrying the kitchen sink into the Twitter to support the phrase "let that sink in." That he has this kind of strange humor, so he just laughed and laughed and laughed about that Maserati. We're going to launch Maseratis in space, old wrecked Maseratis. So I can see him easily, inspired by that to launch his Tesla into space. So, but this really symbolizes, what I think he's really doing is he's going to take his Teslas to Mars, his boring machines, and go there, and it'll be a great inspiration for all of us. So that's it. Appreciate your time, and I don't know if you guys have any questions. We probably have a little bit of time here, about 9 minutes. If you want to ask questions, I'm all ears.
Great presentation, Jim. Appreciate it. Romano has a question. Can you see the chat, by the way, Jim?
Yes, I do. Let me read it here. What is one material limitation that is very important to solve in space? I work for a startup that's attempting to build a space habitat out of graphene composites. Be great if you meet our CTO and team. Okay, happy to. By the way, just get my email from Joseph, and I'm happy to do it. The material limitation, if you're talking about physical materials, yeah, it's really the thing you're working on, which is specific strength, the weight of the material for its strength, and getting stuff energetically into space from Earth is energetically tough. But if you can source this on whatever planet you're going to, like the moon or Mars, that also is a way to get around that. But anything we got to bring from Earth has to be super lightweight. So graphene, I think, is definitely one of those promising materials. It's perspective is one of those things you lose. And I can tell you, when I was in college back in the early 80s, carbon fiber composites were like, wow. There were things you only saw in laboratories. And one of my friends did his master's thesis on them, and I was playing around with these tubes. I was just fascinated. But now they're everywhere. They're in my car, and kids' toys, and you can buy wallets made out of carbon fiber stuff. So yeah, I think graphene and probably other things that we have no idea about will be the thing we need to keep pushing on. Okay, next question. I'm not sure if I say the name right, Joseph. Nice presentation. In the beginning, you showed a slide about hardware versus software centric. Do you have any examples of space software that are going to be in demand in the future? So I think, yeah, what I would say is software-defined satellites are going to be the thing. And the reason I say that is computers, like this desktop I'm using is an Apple, and it does a lot of basic functions, which you have to have as a computer, but it's the software on it that makes it live, right? And creates the value, if you will. A computer sitting here on its own without the software doesn't create value like a satellite in space doesn't, but it becomes a portal for that value creation to happen. So in the same sense that computers have evolved from very specialized machines, to calculate nuclear calculations like ENIAC was used for, to writing love letters today, satellites will do the same thing. And so this will lower the barriers of people using hardware in space, of multiple use, of evolution of the use, and so forth. To me, that's the really biggest one right now.
Nice. Jim, you also mentioned that space missions shouldn't be politicized. So how can you make sure that the government is not getting involved too much into space exploration? Should they? Should they not be involved?
And this is all opinions, right? And I hate politics, by the way. I just hate it.
Me too. This guy.
Yeah. No, I know we just had an election, and anyhow, I don't even turn the TV on because I get these ads for these people. Last night I was watching football and some stupid ad. Some guy says, "I used to be a Republican." Turn the TV off. I'm done. So politics ruins everything good in life, in my book. So not all of you are going to agree with me, and that's just fine. You know, to me, the worst thing you can do is turn over, these critical industries to government, because nothing that the government has ever done other than protect groups of people have they done well. What government do you know builds phones? What government do you know builds computers? What government do you know builds automobiles? Very, very few. And I go back in the Soviet Union. I spent years in the Soviet Union, and the government there did build those things. They were government-owned industries that were controlled with the central plan and all that, and they were shit. And they had a 5-year plan, and they set the price and set the products. And to a large extent, I see our defense industries doing the same thing, where the Defense Department will set a 5-year plan and set the products and the prices, and we'll probably all agree that's a great thing for like nuclear weapons, because we don't want those in the hands of private citizens probably. But things like phones, things like computers, satellite rockets, there's really no inherent philosophical reason why the government ought to be building those. That's really where I come from. And it's just an efficient use of capital. If you want to think of capital, really it's sort of a global enterprise, isn't it? It's like people say science is a global enterprise, that all of humanity owns the science that we've learned. And in the same way, sort of the capital it's concentrated within certain people, but that capital flows. We all have jobs, and that's that capital flowing through our jobs at one level or another. So, it's in our inherent interest to make sure that capital flows the most efficiently and that we get the most value out of it, no matter what, right? So if government is not particularly good at that, you just want to minimize it. And I think we do that by doing what we're doing. Like, the startup, for graphene, congratulations, I love it. That's the sort of stuff we need to do. And it's up to you guys. You're the next generation. I'm about done. You're the next generation. It's going to be up to you guys to be the entrepreneurs and take your dreams and don't let anybody talk you out of it and make them a reality.
Yes. Can you see the next question from Ronald?
I love this one. Tell me what you would have done differently if you were to start SpaceX today compared to the early 2000s. I would make what I call phantom space. That's exactly what we did. So we asked ourselves, this was 3 years ago, we're about 3 years old. We literally started with a clean sheet of paper and said, what do we need to solve today? If we were SpaceX today, and let's assume we've got the talent and the money, what would we do? And we decided that the core problem was space transportation is still not mature, right? And every company I've invested in 11 space companies and been part of them, in the early days in many cases. Every single one of them has a space transportation problem. Either SpaceX wants money too early, or they're difficult to deal with, or they're too expensive, or it's not soon enough, or it's not at the right time, it's not to the right place. So that just clearly hasn't been solved. And until you solve that core thing, you can't build upon it. It's like building a house on a weak foundation. So we decided to do that, and we decided that SpaceX had pretty well cornered the market on large reusable, and the only thing left to innovate in the space was the small mass manufacturer. And we thought that eventually that market would divide, and that we could better service that market, and therefore create this infrastructure efficiency that we sought. So we also realized, looking at what SpaceX has done, that one of the reasons they're successful in Starlink is because they own the launch, and they can control the launch. They do it at their own internal price. How many other companies have thousands of satellites up there? Planet's the only one close enough to it. And launch is one of the things they mightily struggle with, right? And in the case of SpaceX, their control of their launch is very strategic. They use a third of their launches for Starlink. They get no revenue per se out of that, but it's a major part of their capacity. So what we decided was we need to be able to couple that strategic capability we're developing in launch with the ability to field the constellation. So we already have like 3 contracts with constellation providers where we're actually helping them in the early days design, build, fly their satellites when they're in the weakest position, and help them get a step up into space, and then we take sort of the backside revenue share or part of the company for doing this early stuff for them with no exchange of funds. So we've got this sort of almost self-serving ecosystem we're creating, where we're not doing it just for ourselves. We're actually partnering with other companies. And the idea I have is I'm not smart enough to know all these space applications, but there are a lot of other people out there that are. And you'd be surprised at the ones that come knocking on our door. I had one who started a company. It's public now. I won't say, but I use the app on my phone, and they've got a something they figured out how to talk to our cell phones from space. And he's got all sorts of applications for it. I'd never think of that, right? I'm not smart enough to know how to do that. So I want to appeal to that part of the world and enable those smart people, right? Because they're not going to want to take the time to build rockets or even become smart enough to build satellites, which is kind of a specialized form of engineering. And, we tend to be these small, arrogant little people that build satellites, and we don't like to share it with others. So fine, take that off the table and let the innovators innovate in what they're good at. So that's what I think it is. And I don't give a damn for going to Mars personally. That's not on my list of goals. So if Elon does, and that SpaceX, vacates the commercial space arena altogether, then we'll figure out how to take their old customers. Let me see. Would love to know if you had any disagreements with Mr. Elon. Every day. I'll just give you the biggest ones. And by the way, I'm always wrong when it comes to Elon, so you may not want to listen to me. So the first thing was this vertical integration of the manufacturing. So the manufacturing, traditionally the supply chain, you rely on other suppliers, and with that in mind, Elon and I always argued about it. And Elon said, "Oh, to control this, we have to keep it in house." Turns out he was right, but I was very much against it. One of the secrets of Phantom is we use the supply chain, but the difference between now and 20 years ago is that, for example, engines. There were engine suppliers, but they were part of what I call the military-industrial complex, and sort of the government cost structures were reflected in that, i.e., very expensive. So in order to break that, they really had to build their own engines. That was like our first decision at SpaceX. I wasn't opposed to that, by the way, but just to show you sort of the thinking that began there extended all the way through pretty much every system as we went on. So the engines, we knew we couldn't afford what Aerojet and Rocketdyne were building. Plus, we also saw the day when we would become enough of a threat to these guys that Boeing or Lockheed or some of these big primes would try to shut us down through the supplier network. And lo and behold, that day did come along later where, Boeing would try to interfere. I know this sounds petty, but they would interfere with SpaceX by finding out where SpaceX was actually getting things machined. And they would go to them and say, "Look, if you drop SpaceX, we'll pay you X dollars and have you machine all of our stuff over here." And so we were finding machine shops would drop us in the middle of jobs. So what Elon did one time, I think they were called Maverick machining. I went down there, and this had happened, and Elon says, "Go see how much they want to buy the whole company." So I went down and said, Elon wants to know, if you'd sell the company. The guy goes, yeah, give me $2 million. And so I called Elon and he goes, sold. Tell him it's sold. So he bought him. He wrote him a $2 million check and he moved their operation into that facility you saw there, with the McLaren. And so over time, it was a necessity, but it's not that way anymore. So, and then the other thing the reason we don't talk anymore is we disagreed on the Tesla Model S. And, I told him he was insane for going away from the Roadster, which, listen, I own a couple Mercedes electric cars and they're great. It's like the next generation of things. It's a super cool technology, and that's why I like them. And I'm a car fanatic, so this is interesting for me to see the next generation of cars, and that's how I don't look at it as saving the environment or anything like that, because it really doesn't yet. But it's just cool. But they are not ready for prime time. They still aren't. Okay, the infrastructure is not there for charging. Okay, I drive mine thousands of miles, but it takes planning, right? And the average consumer is not ready for it. So my argument was, the guys that buy the Roadsters are like people like me who buy Ferraris and Maseratis, and they put up with bullshit in the cars because you love the car for what it is, and you keep your Ford or your Chevy to drive when the in my case a Jeep when the electric car doesn't work. And that if you mass market these things, which is what he told me the Model S was, I said, people like my mother as a consumer will set it on fire in the driveway the first time it goes belly up on you. And what I didn't realize was Elon was creating a cult, which really, say the Ferrari owners are really kind of a cult, I guess. They're going to be willing to put up with these things. So he created a Tesla cult, an electric car cult. And so I still think that Tesla's going to cross that border at some point where there's no government subsidy. Over here, we get tax incentives to buy the vehicles. I think it's like $12,000 now when you buy an electric car. And that's kind of going in away under Biden. So that part of the business model will go away. And then as they have to sell more and more, the average person's not going to put up with a lot of the little quirkiness that each of these cars have. So he's going to run headlong into that. But he told me I didn't know anything about cars. And that's when he said, well, and by the way, you're no longer a co-founder of SpaceX. And I said, oh, fuck you. I didn't want it anyhow. I almost sent my shares back to him. This was like 2009. I was so pissed at him. And so we've never spoke since then. And I think he's probably still mad at me. Although he gave an interview and was nice about me. So I guess maybe not.